So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Stanley. I am the CEO of Fictionary, and I am here to introduce you to Vaseem Khan, who is a very successful author who writes in multiple genres. We're going to talk about the genres. He's won crime novels, won crime. He's won novels. No, he's won awards for his crime novels, is what I'm trying to say there. He's got a series set in India in the modern Mumbai, which used to be known as Bombay. So it's a historical mystery, a detective novel written in the 1950s. His first book, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, was selected by Sunday Times as one of the 40 best crime novels published in 2015 to 2020 and translated into 17 languages, which is just absolutely amazing. Then we get on to the second series, which won the Shamus Award in the US. So you can tell Vaseem is really into crime writing. He won the Crime Writers Association Historical Dagger, phenomenal. So when he isn't working, Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London. So of course there he's got some real nitty-gritty information behind the scenes. So join me in welcoming Vaseem, and we're going to be here. We're going to talk about his books, his process. Feel free to ask questions as usual. This is the Fictionary community, so all questions are welcome. Greetings from Bristol Bazaar. Okay, so we have, okay, Vaseem, why don't you say hello and whatever it is you want to say about yourself that I didn't say?
Yeah, thank you, Christina. So, the first thing to say is how lovely it is to be invited to talk to you all. And as Christina said, this is an informal session, so interrupt, ask questions. You can ask me anything you like about writing, about life, about cricket, which I know is incredibly popular over in wherever you guys are. I'm happy to answer questions. And other than that, I think we can just dive straight into whatever you want to start with, Christina.
Sure. Okay. So I want to start with your three upcoming books, and I want to talk about genre. So the three books are City of Destruction, The Girl in Cell A, and Quantum of Menace. So let's start with the City of Destruction. So tell us what genre that is written about or written in, and just quickly what it's about.
Okay, so do you mind if I do a bit of a backstory so people can orient themselves
Yes,
mentally
absolutely.
as to my writing journey? Because I understand that you're at different stages of your writing journey. Some of you are waiting to be published, some of you are published, some of you are writing across genres, etc., etc. So I actually wrote my first novel when I was 17, which was a very long time ago. I was reading an author called Terry Pratchett, who writes a series of comic fantasy novels. They've sold 100 million copies now. He's passed on, but back then he was quite relatively new. I thought this looked really easy, so I wrote a comic fantasy, age 17, and I sent it off to some agents. And then I rather foolishly told my parents that I wasn't going to university because I was going to be a rich and famous writer. And you can imagine how that went down, especially with Asian parents. But anyway, there was a small flaw in that cunning plan, which is the book was not very good. And you wouldn't expect it to be at age 17. So it was rejected. I did have to go to university, but at least I knew that what I really wanted to do with my life. And over the next 20 years, I was a management consultant. In my 20s, I went to live in India for 10 years. I was born and raised in the UK, though, but my parents were from the subcontinent. An amazing experience. And that, I suppose, is why when I got back, I wanted to write about India. But I wrote 7 books in 23 years across different genres, right? Because we're talking about genre. I wrote literary novels because I love literary fiction. I wrote historical novels, pure historical novels. I wrote all sorts. And it was only when I wrote The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, you mentioned it's a book about set in contemporary Mumbai in India. It's about a middle-aged policeman who retires from the force, continues to try to solve murders. He's a very serious man, but this surreal circumstance happens to him in that he inherits a 1-year-old baby elephant. And so he has to then go off and try and figure out how to solve this murder while going through this ridiculous thing of looking after this baby elephant. Now, I never expected that book to get published. I never expected to get an agent. I did get an agent. I got a big publisher on board for the series, and it basically gave me a career. And I was age 40 when that happened. So I think the first thing to say is that maybe 20 years ago, age might have been a factor, but now there are so many authors that I know who have been published later in life. And to a certain extent, it's almost better for it to happen that way because your expectations are better managed. At age 17, you expect $1 million contract to land in your lap, and a limousine to come and pick you up from your house and take you. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. So you're more prepared for the realities, often very bruising realities of being published, even if it's by a big publisher, post publication, because it's very difficult to get an agent. It's very difficult to get a publisher. But even if you do all of those things right and you get a tailwind behind your first book, there's still no guarantee that second, third, fourth book, etc. Now, I've been reasonably fortunate. I've had the same big publisher for 10 years, 10 books with them. I now have a second big publisher for a different series, so I'm juggling two big publishers. So things some can go right, but I do honestly feel that the 20 odd years of my apprenticeship, writing 7 novels and improving, has held me in quite good stead as I've moved through these genres. So to get to the various books, so I'll do some book waving. So this was The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra. Sorry, I should have waved that around. But City of Destruction. So this is the new hardback. It comes out in a couple of days in the UK and then in the States a bit later. So this series, and do interrupt me if I'm just going on too long and you want to ask
No,
a
it's
question.
good. I'm just going to say I put up the link to City of Destruction is there right now. So if anyone wants to capture it, there it is in the chat.
So this series came about. So I wrote 5 books in that first series featuring the policeman who has the baby elephant sidekick. That's contemporary India. Then I wanted to. So this is how authors' thinking can evolve. I wanted to explore where that modern India came from, and largely, even though India's a really ancient culture, the modern India that we see today, in a great way, was shaped by the colonial era when Britain, England, it was in India for about 300 years. It completely changed India's future, the dynamic, and what India would go on to become. And the British left in 1947. And that period directly after has not really been that well explored in fiction. There's a very good literary novel called A Suitable Boy, which is about the only one that's done justice to that era. So I said, okay, that's a gap in the market with your sort of commercial thinking hat on. And it's never really been explored using crime fiction before. So I decided to write a series set in 1950 in India. And the series is called the Malabar House novels. And it introduces India's first female police inspector, because India didn't have police detectives at the time, women police detectives. So I introduced India's first female police detective. She's working with an English forensic scientist named Archie Blackfinch, who's come over to help the Bombay force set up their own forensic science unit. And so Persis, who's the lead character, she qualifies. Nobody knows what to do with her. Nobody wants to work with her. So they put her in Bombay's smallest police station called Malabar House. So you can already see these dynamics happening. Persis, Archie, different types of protagonists being forced to work together. It's a common trope in this particular genre, since we are talking about genre. Will they, won't they? Another common trope within crime and mystery fiction, the idea that there will be protagonists who might be engaged in a romantic relationship or might not be if things don't work out. And then an important case lands in their lap, the murder of an English diplomat who's working in India post-independence. And so the rest of the book is about them trying to solve this murder. But thematically, these books are very much an exploration of the post-colonial period in India and looking back at what happened towards the end of the Raj, how India got its independence, the partition riots. So for those of you who don't know, when India became independent, the country was slashed into 3, and a country for Muslims, which became Pakistan, and then another country which was called East Pakistan, which would then later become Bangladesh. And in the middle, we have the expanse of the India that we see today. And 1 million people died in religious riots at the time. So this is the turbulent backdrop that I wanted to explore. And as I often say when I do talks here, especially in the UK, I say, growing up in this country, history was my favorite subject. And I loved studying World War II and World War I and the Tudor period in England. But we never learned about the 300 years that Britain spent in India as colonial as a colonial enterprise. And so I try and reintroduce some of that history. And in each of these books, at the end, I put 2 pages worth of notes of the things that were actually true in this book that I've used to create this narrative. And it's amazing to me how people write to me from all over the world, where they read these books, including Canada and the States, and they're endlessly fascinated at the truth of this period and the Raj era, where just before this period, and some of the things that I use. And again, going back to genre, so this is historical crime fiction, historical mystery fiction. And one of the bedrocks of historical mystery fiction is that readers in this genre expect you to, one, do your research, but then to use that research lightly, but also in an interesting way, so that it adds to the plot rather than becomes information dumps that hinders the plot. And yes, it's a balancing art, but I hope I've done that. And The City of Destruction is the fifth in that series.
Nice. So I was lucky enough to receive an advanced copy of City of Destruction, and fabulous. And while I was reading it, so I just have a couple of questions I want to poke out of there. One is, why a female protagonist?
People ask me this all the time. So I do a lot of talks around the UK and in different countries. And so there's a facetious answer, which is that, because all writers are entitled to write whatever the hell they like, which I strongly believe in. And I'll always put up a fight for writers to write characters who are not from their own backgrounds,
Mhm.
as long as they do justice to those characters and do it respectfully. I mean, I write.
Nice.
I can't say to a writer that you've got no right to write an Indian character, because that would be ridiculous. Because then I wouldn't be able to write any character except someone who mirrors me, and we'd all just be writing autobiography. So it makes no sense. However, at the same time, I am not a woman, clearly, and so I had to be very careful how I did that. And the main reason is this: India in 1950 was a very patriarchal society. Institutions like the police force were incredibly misogynistic. Some might say that they still are. And so for me, putting a male character in, which was my initial idea, then became less interesting than putting a female character into this environment, because instantly she's in conflict. She's in conflict with her environment. She's in conflict with her colleagues. And as we all know as writers, conflict is absolutely essential to the journey of any character. It makes it more interesting for the reader, but it also makes it more interesting for you and me as writers to write that character. So that was the principal
Nice.
reason.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you can just experience this whole story through her, and she feels very real, and you can see the conflict. And we talk about protagonists a lot at Fictionary and how to choose your protagonist, and that's a brilliant answer of this one adds more conflict. So there you go. That's a great reason for picking a certain protagonist that's going to make the story more interesting.
But the other thing, which I'll say very quickly, is that readers love pioneers. Readers love people who are independent spirits and who are doing something that nobody else has done. And Persis is literally the only female police detective in the whole of India. And India at the time was 300 million people. It was the world's largest democracy, and they had
Yeah.
just one female. I mean, they're 1.5 billion now, so you can see how busy they've been in 70 years. But at the time, one woman police officer, police detective level, I mean, officer. And the real one doesn't come along until about 10 years later. But as I said, this period is more interesting for me.
No, it's really fascinating. So now tell us about her name. That was the other thing that I went and looked up kind of, okay, why this name?
So Persis is a Parsi. And in India, we have Hindus, we have Muslims, we have a small community of Catholic Christians, mainly in a particular state called Goa. And then we have Parsis who came originally from Persia to India centuries ago. And Parsis are different from the rest. They've been incredibly influential, very wealthy, but very small community, mainly based in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now known. So Hindus cremate their dead. Muslims and Christians bury their dead. in India, but Parsis don't do that. What Parsis do is they take their dead and they take them to a small wooded area in the middle of Bombay where they have these circular stone towers, and they put the dead body on the stone tower and they allow vultures to come and eat the dead body. And that's because they are Zoroastrians. Vultures are sacred in the Zoroastrian religion. And that process of getting rid of the dead body is called excarnation. And, I came to know a Parsi when I was in India, and I had no idea about this. So I found it amazingly fascinating.
Hmm.
And the two reasons that we have Persis. Persis is a Parsi because it allows me to get away from the Hindu-Muslim conflict scenario, which is very much still hanging over the country in 1950. So Persis can navigate that between the two faiths. And also there were Sikhs as well, but she can navigate between all these different faiths. And her name, funnily enough, comes from a film I saw when I was very young. It's a Star Trek film. So there was a lady in a Star Trek film who was an Indian, I think the first Indian to ever star in a Star Trek film, and she played one of the lead roles opposite Captain James Kirk. And this was still when William Shatner was playing him, and her name was Persis Kambata, I think. She was a model from India who then became an actress, and I just remembered that. I remembered that because she was so striking on screen that I remembered that when I got older. And I said, Persis, that sounds like a name that I can use. And it turned out she was perfect for a Parsi. She is a Parsi.
Fantastic. And I love all the connections of the why behind it. It's really fascinating to see how much thought has been put into it and how much of it is historical and how your past is bringing into it and how much of outside but also inside of you is in the books. That's really interesting. So let's have a look at we'll go to Quantum of Menace, which is we talked a little bit earlier. It's more of a typical mystery versus a detective novel. So talk about that one a little bit and talk about the difference in the genre, if you can, between the two books.
Okay, so I don't have a book to wave around because it doesn't come out till next October. So this, for those of you who aren't James Bond fans, so this book is a new series, and it features the character Q from the James Bond universe. And so this came about because the estate of Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was is the author of James Bond, the original author of the James Bond books. They approached me. They'd read some of my books, and they said, we would like to create a series that features Q rather than James Bond. And we like your style of writing, and we'd like something that's a mystery-based a series featuring Q. Would you like to do it? And so I thought about it for a while because, you'd think that you'd immediately jump at the chance of something like this, but you do have to be careful with projects like this because people are very wedded to their vision of Q because of the films. And then they get very bent out of shape if you create a Q that is not corresponding to their image of Q. And so I thought about it for a while, and then I came back with certain stipulations. I said, look, I'll do it if you allow me to create the Q that I want to create, which will be a real character. And if you watch the James Bond films, you'll know that after a while, Q became a bit of a caricature, just silly inventions and the like. But at the same time, he's been reinvented in the James Bond films with Daniel Craig, with Ben Whishaw, a much younger character playing Q, a much more serious cyber hacker type character. So I didn't want to do either of those. So my Q is going to be in the middle, about age 50. He's booted out of MI6, which is a secret service agency that he and Bond work for. He has to go back to his hometown. His childhood friend, who is a quantum computer scientist, has died under mysterious circumstances, and the police don't really care that much. They think it's a suicide. And then Q has to solve this mystery in a traditional manner of tracing down clues and red herrings and suspects and coming to an eventual conclusion. So it is different to writing a historical crime thriller because you don't have to do the historical research, but it's a completely different animal in terms of making sure that you stay true to certain aspects of the character that, hundreds of millions of people around the world know, and you don't want to, as we say in the UK, piss them off. you want to make sure that you bring them on board, but it's inevitable that you will change some things. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. I do have to work closely with Ian Fleming's family to make sure that they're happy with what I'm producing. And at the end of it, it's called Quantum of Menace, which I'm very pleased about because after what, 12 books, I think it's the first title I've ever been allowed to keep. So this is the thing, when you work with publishers, especially the bigger publishers, they're lovely. It's lovely to have a marketing team and publicity people and all the rest of it. But you give them a title and they all you're sitting around a table with them all and they say, Vaz, that's absolutely wonderful. That's brilliant. That's the greatest title that we've ever heard. And then about 2 days later, you get an email saying, no, actually, we want to change it all because whatever reason. So never get wedded to your titles. This is the first title I've been allowed to keep, Quantum of Menace, which I'm quite happy about.
So now where is that book in the production cycle? Because it comes out not until October, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
what
so
happens
things
now in
so
October?
things have got quite things have got quite congested for me over this next 13 months or so. So I've been going along very nicely, one book a year, which is reasonably comfortable. When you're writing crime and mystery fiction, it's normally the expectation that you put out one book a year. That's what fans largely expect. But I've suddenly got this congested period where I've got City of Destruction, which comes out the day after tomorrow in hardback. Then I've got this small town mystery. It's set in America, psychological thriller, which comes out in May. And then Quantum of Menace comes out in October. And the reason for that is the small town mystery, the psychological thriller, because it was a change of gears. It took me longer to finish than I thought. And so it got put to next year instead of coming out this year. I'll tell you about that in a second, I guess.
Oh,
And Quantum of Menace, because it's with a different big publisher, when you get two big publishers to sit around a table and talk to each other, you get them both vying for the same scheduling slots, because this is something you don't understand until you get published in the industry. There are particular times of the year when particular types of book, it's better for them to come out at. So you really don't want to be coming out as a new author at Christmas when you're battling all of the big celebrity books and celebrity memoirs and all the Christmas books. You really don't want that. So there are times of the year. So, this is why it's got slightly congested.
yeah. Okay. So we have City of Destruction, which is our historical detective. Then we have Quantum of Menace, which is more of a traditional mystery with, we'll call him an amateur sleuth, even though he's not amateur, only because he's not a detective as a profession. So can you talk to us a little bit about the subtleties of difference between the one type of genre and the other?
Well, I think for me personally, the traditional police detective, right, or what you would call a police procedural. I'm sure you call it that in other places as well. That's what we call it in the UK. There are certain tropes. There are certain beats that you have to hit, right? You've got to have a police person working with a team of other police people. Whether they work nicely with them or not is part of the conflict scenario that we all love and enjoy. But they're also bound by police conventions, right? You've got to have your forensics, you've got to have your autopsy, you've got to have your interview cell, interviewing suspects. So there's a path that you can chart through a police procedural. That path does not apply to I won't say renegade detective, but you understand what I mean. Someone who's not officially sanctioned to take on this investigation. So, for instance, to give you a simple example, Q can break into the house of the murder victim and have a little look around. It's his childhood friend. He wants to know, but the police won't let him in for obvious reasons. He's not sanctioned to investigate this. So you have this little beat of drama, which wouldn't happen in a police procedural because the police don't need permission to break into houses. They can go in and forensic units can go in. And Q has to think his way around how can he get access to this forensic evidence. He needs that to be able to progress the case. What right does he have to go and interview? So if he comes and interviews me about this, I'll just kick him in the nuts. I'll say, you've got no right to interview me. Who the hell are you? Whereas a police person can obviously come and show you a police badge and insist that you answer questions. So those are the textual differences that you have to think about when you're doing these different kinds of detective.
Okay. And then, you make the jump to psychological thriller. So still all in the crime area. So let's talk about The Girl in Cell A a bit. First, tell people what it's about, and then we'll talk about the genre aspects.
Okay, so this book is a psychological thriller. And it's about a woman who, at the age of 17, is convicted of murdering the heir to a mining fortune in a small American town. And she's sent away. She denies having done it. She says that she has holes in her memory. She can't remember this incident at all. But she's convicted and she's sent away for 17 years. And then she has to come back to this small American town because she wants to try and figure out, did she do it or did someone else actually do it? And she got the blame for it. And so the book, if you I don't know if we have any psychological thriller fans, but it very much follows the kind of format that you've seen become very, very popular since Gone Girl came on the scene, nearly 20 years ago now. So you've got unreliable narrators, you've got two narrators. So we follow one track where she's getting therapy in prison, where the therapist is trying to get her to go back to the incident and see if they can break through her mind and figure out exactly what happened. And then we've got the second track post prison, where she's come back to this small town and is meeting all of the people who think that she's a murderer, and that uncomfortable situation where she's trying to interview them and ask questions and trying to figure out the truth of who might be the murderer if it's not her. And then of course we have a big revelation at the end, which all of these things need. So that book came about, because psychological thrillers, I love them. I love reading them. And I think that's very important. Whatever genre or subgenre that you decide to write, if you're not yourself a fan of that type of writing, that type of book, I really think it's quite difficult for you. You've got to be a real hardcore fan of that, because then you will read the right things to help you as you go along. And I often say this when I do workshops. I do a lot of workshops, and I say to writers that if you're trying to write a particular kind of book, go and find 5 writers who've been phenomenally successful in that area. Find the book that made them successful. Sometimes it's not the first book. Sometimes it might be the 5th book that suddenly sold 1 million copies, or suddenly won them a massive award, or got all of the recognition. Read 5 of those books, analyze them to death, see what they did right that made them suddenly go from one level in their career to the next level. And as I said, it's rarely the debut, but sometimes it is, but very rarely. And once you've done that, you will have a very good understanding of what it is that you're possibly trying to achieve with your book. So I did all of that, read loads of stuff, analyzed it to death. And that's why it took so long to finish this damn bloody book, because I sold it to my publisher off a 1-page synopsis, because they liked the hook. And it hadn't occurred to me that it would take me so bloody long to finish the damn thing.
Mm-hmm.
But learning as you go, it was new genre for me to write. And so I had to learn as I went. And so it took longer. I mean, I'll tell you how traumatic these things can get. I finished 110,000 words of a first draft about, what God knows, a year and a half or more ago. I showed it to my editor. We both liked it, but we both had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. So I went away and thought about it, did some more reading. And then I came back and I said, I know what's not right. I've written in third person, but most psychological thrillers are now written in first person.
Oh.
It's more immersive. And I've also written in past tense, but most psychological thrillers are written in present tense. So imagine trying to change 110,000 words to first person and to present tense. I mean, that's what I nearly wanted to just get rid of it and said, I don't want to hear about this again. But, so sometimes you have to do things like that when you realize that things aren't working. And it's very important to leave stuff for a while and come back to it, so you can learn what it is that isn't working about a particular book. And so often I've seen this with friends as well, where they've tried to rush a book through, especially when they've got a new idea and they just want to get it into the hands of agents and editors. And it's never as good as if you leave it for a month or two after the first draft and come back to it. And then you may not think so because you've read it already a million times and you think there's no way I could change anything. But you will be astonished how often 2 or 3 month break from it, think about something else. And then you'll suddenly realize, oh my God, there's so many things about this that are not quite hitting what I want to hit.
Okay, so okay. I don't know where to start with that. Okay, so first of all, fascinating that you had to go and rewrite it, not only in tense, but in person. And we talked about that a lot at Fictionary about try and figure out up front, based on your genre, what you want to do with that, because it'll save a lot of time later when you have to reorder it. I see people on the side are pre-ordering your book, so that is absolutely amazing.
Thank you, guys. That's really nice of you.
Yeah, because we have a kind community. Also, because it sounds fascinating, and I'm really thrilled because it's very rarely I get to talk to an author that's across genres, and so it makes it really exciting to look at. Okay, now let's talk about what can you do in a psychological thriller that you can't do in a detective or a mystery, or vice versa. Like, what's the difference between them?
You can lie, is what you can do. You
Right?
can lie a lot. So, unreliable, I mentioned unreliable narrators. So it's not direct lying, but it's very much the expectation that when you're reading first person narratives, especially when there's more than one voice, the reader realizes that at some point we're going to understand that one of these people is either not telling us the truth or has got a twisted version of the truth that we are being presented with. And sooner or later, the author, will tell them which is the true version of the truth. And you'll see this all the time. So I think that's the main difference as a writer and as a reader. How do you do that without
Mm.
telling outright lies? So that's the difficulty. That's the difficult part, because outright lies breaks the contract between author and reader. And you can't do that because you lose crime readers, especially experienced crime readers. And even with the best will in the world, sometimes you will get people get to the end of a psychological thriller where there's a big twist, and then they just want to throw the book at the wall because the twist doesn't suit what they'd already built into their mind. And I'm sure some people will do that with my book, and that's fine. But the other big thing that you have to absolutely have with a psychological thriller is one or more twists. There have to be moments where people instantly say, "Oh my God, what has just happened here? How has this story pivoted?" If they're not saying that at least once or twice in this book, then you have not really written a psychological suspense thriller, or you've not written it properly.
So when you're looking at the detective side, so the reader's expecting that the writer's going to write it, um, that the detective what they're thinking, saying, etc., they believe is true. It might not be. They could have the wrong information or whatever, but in their minds, they think they're telling the truth. Is that right?
Absolutely. So one of the exercises I often do. While in the course of writing this book, I spoke to a lot of my very good psychological thriller friends, so Ruth Ware and Claire McIntosh and Karen Slaughter over in the States, and just getting their advice, just chatting things through with them. How do they do this so effortlessly? And they say it's not effortless, Vaz. So shut your face. It's bloody difficult. It's bloody hard work coming up with new ideas and new twists. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But you've got to go with something that you believe in for that story. And often they start with that hook. They get this idea of a particular hook, and then they build a story around that particular twist, that particular hook. Sorry. So what was the question that you just asked me? The
What did I just ask? Good God, I was listening to your answer and forgot what I asked. I was asking about, oh, the detective. Can um, they have to basically think what they think is real. They're not lying to the reader. They're thinking what they know at that time.
Yes. So the exercise I often do is at various points throughout the book, I will put it down and I'll say, okay, now just on a piece of paper, just write a couple of sentences about what conclusions you think the reader should have drawn by now or could have drawn by now. So
Interesting.
about
Okay.
100, say 50 pages in, 100 pages in, again, 200 pages, a halfway mark. What is it based on what you've presented to them through these unreliable narrators, or through the narrative as a whole, if you're not using unreliable narrators, where have you led them? What do you want them to believe? That what are they concluding? Did she murder? So, for instance, did she murder this? Do we think she murdered this person, or do we think not? Or because I've by now halfway stage, I've presented some alternate suspects. Which one do they think is looking the most guilty out of this lot? If it's not going to be her, and why? Why do they think that? So you can break it down a bit further. And when you do that, what happens is you might bring to light for yourself that actually you haven't done a good job here because you haven't given the reader enough of a ladder to believe in a particular suspect's guilt or otherwise. So that means you have to go back now and tweak things so that they do come to that conclusion you want them to come to.
Okay, so now I got to ask a very specific question. Okay,
Mm.
two-part question. Do you do this when you've written a draft and you're editing? And how do you pick out what you think you've shared with the reader?
Okay, so I'm a person who believes in plotting quite meticulously before I begin writing. So I'll spend 2 or 3 months just plotting. And I'm very sad, as my wife keeps telling me, because I use spreadsheets. So I was a management consultant for a long time. So my wife's very funny because she'll come into the room and so with my historical series, I use dry humor, right? And she'll see me. I'll have written a line and I'm laughing. And she'll stand there and she'll look at me and say, only crazy people laugh at their own jokes. And I say, that's really unfair. It's very unfair. Anyway, so I will plot very meticulously before I begin. But no matter how meticulously you plot, you will find, and you all know this as writers, that as you write, things can change, characters and scenes suddenly become a bit more fluid and dynamic. Something interesting hits your brain, and you decide, oh yeah, I've got to put that in now. So that's part of the process of during the planning and the writing stage. Then I will pick out bits where I put in red herrings and clues and where I think the conclusions are coming from. And the other thing is, you have to first and foremost, I said, be a reader of this genre that you're reading in. And so I will have, like half a dozen books in that space where I've got my pen and I've gone through, and I'll be reading a Ruth Ware book that's very similar, perhaps. And or Karen Slaughter one which is one I was reading recently. And there will be notes on the sides of this book where I said, okay, great. This is where she has clearly given us a little hidden bit of foreshadowing, a bit of a clue that this is going to lead to something later on. And then when I get to that page, I'll say, great, see, I spotted it. I managed to. So I know what she was getting at, what she wanted me to think at that point. And if it doesn't happen, then she's done an even better job because she's fooled me. But either way, I've learned something. I've learned what she wanted the reader, how she was misdirecting the reader at a particular point in time.
Nice. And okay, so I do that twice, once when I first read the book, and then after I've read the book, I go back and read again, and then I look for stuff that was planted. You're like, oh, there it is. And it'll be like in the middle of some paragraph, and you think that was a
Yeah.
really important sentence that I think your mind subconsciously, as a reader, you realize it, but you don't think about it. But when you're really looking for the story ended up here and
Mm.
all the little clues, it's really fun to go to somebody's book and start.
When you talked about kindness, right? And uh, for the 10 years that I've been in this industry, I've had so much kindness from really big name writers who, from my first book, decided that they were going to give me some support and help, bang the drum a little bit, and then later advice on career and other projects and that. And so that's one of the reasons why I do so many workshops when I'm asked, because I feel, it's really great to try to make your own way in this industry, but none of us can be successful in this industry, I feel personally, without the support and help of others, even if it's bloggers and or critics and reviewers and readers, of course, ultimately who we need on board. But just the very first few people who are your earliest readers, your agent, if you have one, and the editor who has to be passionate about about your work. Otherwise, you're not going to get very far at all, unless you choose to go down the self-publishing route, which is another brilliant and democratic way now of getting your work out there, which wasn't an option when I was young. It wasn't. So it's great that we now have those options.
Yeah. Okay. So let's ask a question about of writing and editing. What's the hardest thing for you? What's your struggle point when you're trying to get through a book? Is there a moment that typically is hard for you?
It's usually about 12 o'clock when I get hungry. And then my brain shuts down each day. So
Fair.
I'm very routine oriented. So you talked about earlier, just before we came online, about how hardworking your gang is at Fictionary. And if there's one thing I can reiterate, the difference that I have seen between writers who achieve somewhere along their goals, and those who don't, it's hard work. So much of this is putting in the hard work to learn your craft, to learn your genre, to learn the kind of things that you're passionate about writing, but then to do them well. So often the mistake I see by new writers is that they get super excited by an idea, but they haven't put in the years of learning how to write properly for that particular type of book. They tear away at 20,000 words, they get completely stuck, they hit a wall. They haven't planned this thing out at all. They just got excited by an idea, and then they give up and they never come back to it, or they come back to it after so long that they've wasted so much time and effort and energy. Um, and so I think putting in the hard work on a daily basis, reading or editing or working on an idea plan, or actually writing. And there's nothing that teaches you more than finishing books. May not be published, that book may not be the one, but every time you finish a book and then you go back and you edit it and you see the mistakes you've made, or you eventually send it out and you get some feedback, not likely these days, but from agents, but you can get feedback from book circles and reading circles and author circles, which is really useful, and writing courses. None of this was available when I started writing at age 17. So it's amazing that we have this great, forums like your own and others that can help people to learn their craft. But that's the number one reason for rejections. And I've asked this question of many, many top agents in this country. The number one reason that books are rejected is because they're simply not written to a standard that an agent would feel comfortable sending on to a publisher. They're simply not. They can be a great concept, and that's great. An agent can work with you if you have a great concept and a great hook. But if the writing is too far away from what can be seen by a publisher as publishable and inside a bookshop on a shelf, then you're not going to get published. It's that simple. And there's no shortcut to it. There really isn't. If you ask me, writing courses are brilliant because they force you to do this.
Mhm.
I wasn't lucky enough when I was young to have any writing courses around to attend, but I strongly recommend workshops and writing courses and talking to people in the industry. The only exercise I really did which is probably a really good exercise, it certainly helped me a lot. In my 30s, I made a list of 100 of the greatest greatest novels ever written. So you take Booker Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winning novels, fiction. The Times has a list of the 100 greatest ever novels, and various newspapers. And you just make a list. And, you have books like Ulysses at the top, and The Handmaid's Tale is in there, and all sorts of books that you might not normally choose to read. And then I spent 5 years reading them and analyzing them and to death. And some of them are brilliant. You can really get on with them. Some of them maybe you'll read a Hemingway and you'll think, yeah, this is not my cup of tea. I don't see what all the fuss was about. But at the end of those 5 years, if you did that, there's no way. I mean, I was a much, much better writer by the end of that. Better mastery over prose, better idea of how different writers use setting, especially because these books were set all over the world, different periods, different styles that they've used. I mean, I can say a direct inspiration for the books that I write set in 1950s India is Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children.
Okay.
Because, that covers that particular period just up to independence and just past independence. But he also writes with very dry humor. and I use that in my historical novels. So you can learn. We're in the constantly learning from other writers who've achieved great things. There's nothing wrong with that.
It's for me, it's okay. Who doesn't like to sit around and read in this crowd? And then you can use it as an excuse. You're actually being productive because you're learning and you're teaching yourself. So it just is such a great excuse to read more books. City of Destruction. Let's talk about how you decided what setting to put in and what not to put in, and how you put it in. Because because I had a sneak peek at it, you can, when you read it, you really feel Bombay. Like you just feel it without thinking, now I'm reading about a description of the city and I want to skim it, right? You really feel it. So how do you do that?
Well, it didn't hurt that I lived there for 10 years.
Right?
But that was modern. That was modern Bombay rather than historical. So getting into the historical is a little bit harder. And you do the kind of things that anyone who does historical writing has to do. You have to think like a historian. And it was my favorite subject at school. But my parents wouldn't let me study it. Typical Asian parents, I had to study accounts and whatnot. I don't regret it. I had a great career as a management consultant, but there's lots of archives that you can get into now, and in this era, it's wonderful because a lot of those archives are online. You don't have to go and sit in a dusty library somewhere. But particularly, I love podcasts. There's a lot of historical podcasts that can bring that era to life for you, and social media groups. So there's a Facebook group called Old Bombay, for instance, where people who've lived through it or who have grandparents who've lived through it, they put up photographs and stories of going through that period, and they're just brilliant. Pathé News on YouTube is absolutely brilliant for clips of that era. So you take an amalgamation of all of these sources,
Mhm.
and then you put some of your own sort of spin on it, and you try and bring a period to life. And I think with historical fiction, as I've said, the trick is 98% of your research will never go into the book because it will become heavy-handed.
Right.
But you need to have done all of that research, because as you're writing, you'll suddenly come across a particular scene, and suddenly, bang, you remember that you'd read something and it perfectly fits a couple of sentences for that scene, which just give that scene that extra character and tone that distinguishes it from an average effort by someone new to writing historical crime fiction from someone who's actually got a bit of experience and knows how to do it properly. Not that I'm saying I know how to do it properly, but I'm just saying.
I think you do, though.
uh,
Let's just say, yep, it's pretty good.
uh,
Lisa wants to know, did you go back while you were planning and or writing to inspire your ideas, or did you do it all from memory?
you know, people ask me this, and I always joke. I don't really want to go 4,000 miles to see my mother-in-law. But that's a joke because my mother-in-law is actually very lovely. So she's a really lovely lady. They're busy having a big fat Indian wedding at the moment, right?
Oh,
So I'm a Muslim, but my wife's a Hindu, and they're busy having. She's been sending me videos from Bombay, where they're having her nephew is getting married, and honestly, this wedding, he's on a horse, and all sorts of amazing things are going on. So yeah, great fun. No, I don't go back as often as I would like to. No, I don't. I just don't have the time to do that, unfortunately. But I have my missus to go and do research for me and take videos if I need any videos of modern Bombay.
okay. Now, if anyone wants to ask questions, now's the time because we've got 8 minutes left. So feel free to come off mute or put a question in the chat. I just wanted to go back there and remind people. And while you're thinking about that, of course, my favorite question is, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you started writing?
The importance of the second book, I think it cannot be emphasized enough. It cannot be emphasized enough. The second book. So when you're new and you're shiny and you're glossy and everybody loves you, because everybody loves a debut, and that's why we hear these ridiculous stories, which are not true. For 99% of the cases, most debuts do not get six-figure deals. It does not happen. Okay, but you only hear about the ones that do because they make better news stories. But when you're shiny and new, the reviewers are more encouraged to review you Your publicist is more behind you because they're ordered to be behind you, because you're new and they want to give you a good start. And readers, readers are wedded to their series, and they're the ones that they love, but they're always looking around, saying, "Oh, what's new in the market? Is there something that we can have a look at?" By book 2, unless book 1 has been tremendously successful, a lot of that has vanished. A lot of that love and support has vanished through not through ill will, but just because that's the dynamics of the industry. Publicists have only got so many hours in the day, and reviewers can only review so many books. So they're not, I'm quite lucky that even my 5th book is getting reviewed in this series by most of the national newspapers, but not all of them. Some of them will say, "Vaz, we're not going to review that, but we will review Quantum of Menace, your Q book, when it comes out later in the year." So I'm fortunate, but I'm not, typical of what normally happens with these things. So what does that mean? Practically, it means that take more time over that second book, especially if you're doing a series, but it equally applies if you're doing standalones. Make it as good as, if not better than, the first book. And the problem is that the dynamics of the industry often dictate that your first book, you had years, you had all the time in the world to finish it because, you didn't know it was going to get published. So you took your time over it. As soon as you've got a two-book contract, and most new contracts with big publishers are 2 books, they immediately put you on this 1-year turnaround and say, "Oh, I want the second book within X period because we need to get another book out next year while you're still hot." And that's when you rush. And resist the urge to rush. Resist the urge to put in a substandard book, because you will see this happening. Your first book, okay, maybe it's come down. You'll suddenly fall off a cliff if your second book is really bad. I'm not saying you would do that. I'm not saying any of you would do anything like that, but I'm just saying I've seen it happen to too many people I do know. They're rushed into a second book and it just doesn't meet muster. And I'm not saying their career is over. People endlessly reinvent themselves in this industry, and that's one of the beauties of this very harsh industry at times, that you can reinvent yourself and come up with a new idea. And you can go completely in some other direction as well. You can stop writing crime and do romance or do sci-fi or whatever. And you will get a second chance from this industry if you do a good job.
Nice, nice. Okay, so Dan wants to know, what's the best writing technique you ever discovered? Ever?
Well, for me, it's very much to do with the planning phase that I described earlier. Because there are famous writers, friends of mine, Anne Cleeves, Lee Child, who will famously, we've had arguments about this, who will famously come up and say on stage, "No, I don't plan. We don't plan. Yeah, we have an idea and then we just go with the flow." I feel they're being slightly tongue-in-cheek because they're such great writers and they've had such success that I think that some level of planning is involved. So I would say the number one thing is plan before you begin writing. It's not for everybody. I get that. Some people just want to go with the flow, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just be aware of the pitfalls of just going with the flow, that you might lose your way somewhere along the line.
Okay, and then Karen would like to know, would it be advisable to go out into the world with 2 books in hand, meaning then you don't squish yourself into that year for the second book?
No, very unadvisable. Not if you're going towards traditional publishers. So the worst thing you can do is so just to tell you, so take my agent, for instance. He's one of the oldest agencies in the country, 100 years old. They get 4,000 submissions a year. There's no way he can possibly read all those submissions. And he only takes on about 2 new writers a year. So 2 out of 4,000. So he's looking for, I'm sorry, I'm not saying this to discourage anybody, but just to give you a realistic picture of what's happening out there if you approach, agents and publishers. So what he's looking for is a concise synopsis. He's looking for 3 really good chapters, but he might not even get past the first 10 pages if it's poorly written. But he also wants a covering letter which tells him precisely where that book will sit. Who are the customers it can be marketed to? What are the hooks that you've got in there that are different? And so what is different, but what's the same? So is it similar to Harry Potter? Great, because there's a huge audience for that stuff. But what makes it different enough that any publisher would want to publish it? What's your unique take on this Harry Potter style series? So You have to be very concise and clear about that book. As soon as you start putting in there, oh, by the way, I've got this other book, which is completely different, then you're going to start losing that agent. The agent's going to say, this person's all over the place. They're not focused on giving me a product that I can, really pitch because, I'll pitch this product and then that writer will go off and try and write something different. And I won't get a second book out of them in that series if it's successful. So you've got to be absolutely laser focused and you've got to do a real sales job in your covering letter.
Okay, so what if it's a series? Is it different if it's the second book in a series?
No, but they don't really need to know about it. What they do need to know is that you intend to do a series. Remember, agents only get paid when they sell books. And if they can sell more than one book, they're happier. And that's why they love series. They love pitching series to publishers, commissioning editors, as we call them, at these big publishing houses, because they know that if they can hook them in for one book, they would probably buy two books because it's a series. And every publisher, their nightmare scenario is they publish the first book in a series. It's unbelievably successful, but they haven't contracted the writer for the second. So that's why they're always two book deals normally with big publishers
Oh,
in a series.
interesting.
And
Okay.
they don't want you to wander off somewhere else.
Right. Okay. So we have 1 minute left, and I'm going to end it with a lovely question from E.A. Carter, which is, which author would you say influenced your writing the most?
Well, I've mentioned a couple of them. So Terry Pratchett when I was young, Salman Rushdie because of his style of writing and what he writes about. And if there's an American writer who's influenced me, it's a writer called Michael Connelly who writes the Harry Bosch novels, who I love, and this is one of the lovely things about this industry, that if you get far enough in it, you can get to meet some of your heroes. And he came over to the UK. We were doing an event together, and I got a chance to chat to him. And he's such a down to earth and humble guy for someone who sold God knows 100 million books or whatever. And he also, I asked him, because just as I'm talking to you about lessons learned, I asked him about lessons learned, and he said, well, Vaz, I use a lot of the stuff because he was a police journalist, a crime journalist. He had the crime beat in LA. And he said, I try and use it. And that's why his books, when you see the police procedural aspects of it, you'll sometimes see Harry Bosch doing filing for 3 pages, but somehow he makes that interesting. And he says that's the reality of policing. Whereas, he says, I often read police procedurals where from scene 1, he's going at 100 miles an hour in a car and shooting people. And he says, that happens in Harry Bosch, but there's also these other aspects of policing. And he says that's what people seem to have loved about the book. So there you go, lessons from the master.
Fantastic. Well, I got to say, this was a fascinating discussion about books and genre, and so many real tips in here for people to take away, which we really appreciate. This is a crowd of people who are all learners and trying really hard to write a great book. And you've been very generous with your time. So thank you very much. There will be a recording. It will go out to the community. It usually takes us a couple of days to get there. One comment is, I could listen to Vaseem for hours, every sentence filled with incredible detail on topics we love.
Well, thank you. That's more than my wife has ever said. I have to say that.
Should I email your wife with that?
I'm making fun of her because she's 4,000 miles away in India. So I wouldn't dare to say anything if she was actually here.
She could hear you.
Anyway, it's been lovely spending the time with you. And I do sincerely wish you all. Somebody wrote to me recently after a workshop. He said, I really felt that you were rooting for us. And that's because I do. I absolutely want writers to make the best of their writing journeys. And we discussed earlier about the fact that success looks different for different writers. Goals can be different. But the one goal that we all have, the one thing that's successful for all of us, is the sheer act of writing, because it fills us with joy. And that's why we do it. And if we didn't, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Great. Yes, fantastic. Well, thank you. That's a really lovely positive note to end on. And it's been an absolute joy talking to you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.